Hi everybody, welcome back. This will be part 2 of my 3-part lecture on the Phaedo by Plato. Last time I left you with the question of, is death harmful to the people we leave behind? It's kind of left up in the air. It feels like Plato sort of is very dismissive towards Xanthippe, Socrates' wife. In this text, she doesn't get a lot of say. She gets kicked out of the room. But today we're going to be switching to talking about something that needs explaining, which will be the main thing that's going to be explained in the majority of this dialogue, which is, why is it the case that Socrates says he's not afraid of dying? Right? So Socrates' friends, his interlocutors, Simmias and Cebes are kind of his main interlocutors in this dialogue, want to know, hey, you seem like you're really calm. You seem like you're okay with this happening. We would like you, please, before you die, to explain how you can be so calm in the face of death. And Socrates replies, yeah, sure. I'd love to talk about this. I love philosophy. This is what I want to do forever until the moment that I die, which is actually going to be in a couple hours. So this is what they're doing in this dialogue. We need to explain, why is it that Socrates isn't afraid to die? And there's 2 reasons for this. So one, he tells us dying is separating the soul from the body. This is something we talked about last time. Dying is, your soul leaving your body and being free of your body and moving into a different form of life. And also, this is something that, according to Socrates, we want if we're philosophers. And philosophers here recalls really the root of the word, lovers of wisdom. If we really love wisdom, we won't want to stay in our own bodies. And so we're going to explain through the arguments, we'll see, and why that is. Why is a soul being separated from one's body desirable for a philosopher? And second of all, the reason that Socrates is not scared to die is that we have souls that are eternal. We have basically a life that persists after we die. And Socrates is going to provide us with 3 arguments in this dialogue to support this idea. And I'll outline them in a second, but I just also want to note in the 3rd part of the lecture, I will be addressing some of the objections that Socrates receives from Simmias and Cebes against his arguments. So these arguments aren't sort of uncontested the way they sometimes are in Socratic dialogues. They very much are seen in some parts, although maybe not as deeply, as problematic by his interlocutors. So the 3 arguments that Socrates gives us, we typically call, first of all, the cycle of opposites argument, which we will see, and maybe you can point out for yourself, recalls some arguments from the pre-Socratics who we saw earlier this semester. Secondly, the argument from Recollection, which will resemble the argument we saw Socrates give us in the Meno, the argument that we must have existed before we were born because we must be remembering things as opposed to simply learning new things that we'd never known about before. And finally, the Affinity Argument. That's the 3rd argument that Socrates gives us in this dialogue for the immortality of the soul. And the Affinity Argument is meant to prove the other half of the before and after our life bit. So the Recollection Argument is meant to prove that we existed before we were born, and the Affinity Argument is meant to prove that we also are guaranteed to exist after we die. Because of course it might be the case that we existed before we were born, but we're going to stop existing at the end of our human lifespan, right? It might be that we're like long-lived but not eternal. So the argument really needs to show that souls are not only long-lived, but that they are actually eternal. They expand backward and forward to infinity. Okay, so at the end of this part of the lecture, we get to a point where we talk about the question of why it is desirable for the philosopher to separate their soul from their body, why death is actually kind of a cool thing for a philosopher. It's an opportunity for them to achieve the thing they've been trying to achieve, and what sort of soul a philosopher should be concerned with acquiring. Right, so I guess let's dive into it. So this is a painting called The Death of Socrates, which I've been lucky enough to see in person. You can look it up on the internet, but it's probably the most famous work depicting the death of Socrates. So that's Socrates over here on the left side of my head. And he is about to grab a cup, which is right here, full of hemlock. And he's also discoursing to his friends who are on either side, who are sort of grieving, right, because he's about to die. So this depicts the last moments before his death. So it takes place at the same time as the events of the Phaedo. So this is where we're at. We're in this cell, and Socrates is going to tell us about why the soul is immortal, why he's in a good place, he's not scared, he's going to die. I want to make my argument before you, my judges, as to why I think that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be of good cheer in the face of death, and to be very hopeful that after death he will attain the greatest blessings yonder. I will try to tell you, Simmias and Cebes, how this may be so. I am afraid that other people do not realize that the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying. Now, if this is true, it would be strange indeed if they were eager for all this all their lives, and then resent it when what they have wanted and practiced for a long time comes upon them. So he's saying philosophy is essentially the practice of preparing for death. Now, metaphilosophically, obviously lots of contemporary philosophers have other things to say about what philosophy is about and what its aims are, but for Socrates, he lays it out for us. Philosophy is all about preparing us for this moment. And so, of course, it makes sense that once it comes, a true lover of wisdom will not be afraid. And so Simmias laughs and he says, a lot of people think this is pretty much crazy, so you have to explain this to us. And Socrates says, oh, of course, I would love to explain it to you. So we start off, and Socrates repeats again his definition. What is death if not the separation of the soul from the body? His interlocutors agree, yeah, that sounds reasonable. That sounds like what death is. If it's not that we dissolve and turn into nothing, then it must be the separation of the soul and the body. So, recall again, if death is turning into nothing, then it's not something we should fear because it's ceasing to exist. We won't feel any pain, so why be scared? But the other alternative is that we have an afterlife, in which case, minimally, death is the separation of the soul from the body in this metaphysical picture. Okay, so we've established the definition. So this is the handout on the Phaedo that hopefully you should be able to find on Moodle. And this is the part here we're talking about, the beginning of page 2. So this is page 1. It has an outline of the dialogue and the main questions in the dialogue. And part 2 here has the main points of this argument. So why is it that he who has lived as a true philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he's about to die? And again, as we saw, death is the separation of the soul from the body. If we define it that way, then if this is so, we can show that a philosopher shouldn't be worried about this. So why should we not be worried about this? Well, first of all, according to Socrates, philosophers shouldn't care about material pleasures in the first place, right? So like, for example, eating, drinking, bodily indulgences, having fun, partying, all that stuff. It shouldn't be something that we care about because those are things that benefit the body. But a philosopher who loves wisdom should care primarily about their soul. And as it'll turn out, as we'll see, and we'll reiterate later in the dialogue, the things that are true and eternal are revealed only in thought, only when the soul sees it. So you can't see what's true with your eyes on this Socratic picture. You can only see what's true kind of intellectually. And we'll talk about this more when we get into the theory of the forms, which we'll mention later in this lecture. So the soul really seeks things like that. It seeks ideals. It doesn't seek material, particular things that are not eternal or immortal, and they're ephemeral. Socrates also suggests that material things are the source of all that is evil. So they're distractions to doing philosophy. When I have to kind of get up from my reading, unfortunately, which happens very often, like it'd be great, here's a book on ancient Greece, I just, spend all day reading, unless, I were to need, like my body need material sustenance, like I need food. I sometimes need to socialize, as it's making clear, with quarantine, we all really, really suddenly wish we could get together with each other and hang out, but it's the one thing we can't do. But for Socrates, all of these things are kind of bodily pleasures, bodily needs, and they distract us from doing the important work of the soul, which is a kind of contemplative inner vision of the ideal, right? We need to worry about what is good, what is beautiful, what is virtuous. We need to be doing philosophy. That's the best and most important thing we can do for our souls. And that's just something we can't do while we have to attend to the needs of the body. If that's true, if all the material stuff, all the things that our bodies need are distractions from doing philosophy, then dying, separating the soul from the body, is good, right? As philosophers, we strive to separate the soul from the body anyway. So philosophers, what we really love to do is spend all day reading our Plato and Aristotle, discussing with other philosophers like the big issues about the universe, what happens to us after we die and stuff like that. But our body gets in the way. So if death is the separation of the soul from the body, then that's something we should definitely want, right? So with that, now we need to prove that the soul is immortal, right? Because it wouldn't be really very helpful if it turned out that we die, but then we just sort of cease to exist. So how do we show that? We start with the cycle of opposites argument. The cycle of opposites argument is kind of simple, really. It just says, look, life is the opposite of death, and also, secondarily, opposites come from opposites. If you put kind of these two premises together, you get the implication that life comes from death. Therefore, if our souls are living, they must have come from something that's dead. So we that are living must have come from a thing that was dead. And the implication then is that the thing that was dead is the soul that is now alive. And so the soul has existed before we were born. So how do we prove that opposites come from opposites? Socrates invites us to think about paradigmatic contrasts like the smaller and the larger. He says, well, smaller things come from larger things that get smaller. And larger things come from smaller things that get larger. So opposites come from opposites. In order to grow, you need to be getting bigger from something that's smaller. In order to shrink, you need to get smaller from something that's bigger. Also, worse things come from better things is the idea. So in order to become worse, you need to start off better and then become worse. And in order to get better, you need to start off worse and then become better. And then we're supposed to imagine, well, isn't the opposite of life death? Doesn't that then necessitate that the living come from the dead? And then we're invited to imagine this analogy. Life is like being awake, like waking up is the result of someone coming out of sleep. So coming to be alive is the result of someone who was dead, so to speak, coming to be alive. That is, the soul, which was in Hades before, moving to be alive. That's what life comes from. Life is the opposite of death, but it is carried by this one kind of substantive thing that goes from having the property of being dead to having the property of being alive. You might hear in this argument lots of these elements of pre-Socratic theory, right? If the Milesians, a lot of them really liked the idea that opposites come from opposites, and that the dense, the dense comes from the not dense, or that the hot comes from the cold, and they sort of produce each other as opposites. They differentiate from each other, maybe, depending on the theory. And here, Plato's kind of appealing to those intuitions. You can also see here kind of an implicit rejection, right, of the Parmenidean metaphysics. Implicitly, Parmenides would not have liked the idea that what is not comes from what is, right, or that what is not, so that what is comes from what is not. But that's there in this subtext. He's maybe kind of nodding over to the ancients, as he called them in that passage. Now, who knows how effective that argument is for showing that the soul is immortal, right? You might be like, oh, okay, fine, maybe I accept that life comes from death, right? Like, for example, this is a jar that I keep in my office with plants in it. Let me see my plants here, my lovely plants. This particular jar is what we call a terrarium, and it's a closed terrarium, and it's self-sustaining. As long as it gets sunlight, if it's properly sealed, it doesn't need any more water than what's already in the system, and all of it cycles through. So the system produces its own source of nutrients, and its own decay helps it propagate as well, as long as it gets some sunlight, some energy. Now, mine isn't properly sealed, so I do occasionally water it, but if you would like to keep a terrarium, it's really convenient and easy, because if you're away for any period of time, it'll stay alive. And as you can see, this guy's pretty happy. There's a lot of green in there. But this would be an example of why you might think, oh yeah, sure, fine, I accept that opposites come from opposites, just like in this terrarium environment. The death that occurs inside this terrarium helps to promote the life that happens in the terrarium. So what this gets us to then is the question, how effective is this argument? Is it true that all opposites come from opposites? Life and death seem kind of an easy example in a way, but is it the case that the thing that's alive is the very same thing as the thing that was dead before? This is an important question. Because if it turns out that the thing that's alive is a different thing than the thing that was dead, if they don't share some kind of substantiality, then the argument doesn't work so well, right? Because what we need is for there to be a soul that is the thing that is both dead at one moment and then alive at another moment. Luckily, this is not the only argument that Socrates gives us. So the next argument is called the Recollection Argument, which will be familiar from the Meno. The Recollection Argument basically suggests that if anyone knows anything, this is this part here, they must have known it before, right? So for example, and this is the main example that's used in this dialogue, which was not used in the Meno, so it's kind of new. Knowledge of the equal is something you can't explain by talking about your sense experience. So there are certain things that I can know about that are things that I know about through seeing, right? So for example, here's this jar of water, all right? This jar of water is something that I know about from seeing it. And I know that it's moving around. I know that this is glass. You can hear it. It makes a noise that's very distinctive of glass. You can see it's got kind of a gold rim down here. Like there's all sorts of things you can figure out about this glass. But then there's certain kinds of things that I can't find out about, according to Socrates, from using my eyes, right? Or my ears, or my sense perception. And I'll give you an example. So take these objects. These are just sort of little votive candle holders that I'm using to keep paper clips and thumbtacks in. But they're very similar. Hopefully you can see that they're the same shape. They're the same color, they're made of the same material, they're probably manufactured by the same person. And this is an important thing that we're figuring out, that these two are equal in some way. They are the same size, same color. We want to say these things about these objects. But where do we find out about this notion of similarity? Where do we get that from? Like, where do we get the idea that some things are the same as each other and some things are not the same as each other? Why are these two the same, but these two and this is different? Where do I get that idea from? Socrates suggests I can't get that idea from my sense perception, because there's no way that the notion of equality is something that I directly see. So I see properties like green directly, and I see properties arguably like size, maybe even directly. But where do I get the idea that this is the same as that? Well, here's one possibility, is that I've seen lots of things that are similar to each other, like these things. And if I see lots of combinations of those things, so for example, here's two red pens. They're different from each other actually, but they've got the same color, right? And they're both pens, so they've got some similarity. If I see lots of things like that, lots of pairs of things that are equal, and maybe lots of pairs of things that are unequal, take for example, these are different from each other. If I see just lots of assemblages of those things, like all of these books on the shelf are similar and that they're all books, but they're all different because they're different colors and different sizes and all that stuff. After a while, maybe you could think, oh, my sense perception builds the idea of equality, or it builds the idea of difference. But there's a problem with that, which is that when did you get the concept of difference or of similarity? How do you even start making comparisons unless you already have a preconceived notion of things resembling or not resembling each other? And this is where Socrates gets us to the notion that maybe we know what the equal is, what something is that is the same as something else, either numerically identical or qualitatively similar to something else, from something before we were born. We have it innately, so we can't have seen it with our sense perception, so we must have gotten it intellectually, innately from some earlier moment. So Socrates argues that the reason we can make sense of equality and inequality is that we have seen the equal. We have seen this mysterious, idealized, universal thing called the equal. This is the most equalist of the equal things. And it is with that concept in mind that we then apply it to the things that we see with our sense perception. And this thing that is the equal, we must have seen before we were born. Yeah, let that sink in for a minute. So the idea is all of these properties that are more than sense perception induced might be things that we have seen before we were born. For example, the equal, the greater and the smaller, all these comparative notions, and also the beautiful. So how do we know that things are beautiful? Well, we've seen lots of beautiful things, but it often feels as if when we see a beautiful thing, we are recognizing what is beautiful. We are kind of identifying, remembering, oh yeah, this is a little bit like the beautiful, is what Socrates is saying. And he's going to then conclude that this is how all of these universal applied concepts that are purely intellectual work. We have seen them before we were born, and so we're just recollecting. And what is the sense in which we have seen them? Well, it must be the sense in which our souls have seen them, because of course our bodies have a limited span of life. So learning, it turns out, as we see here, is nothing other than recollection, and the soul must have existed before birth. So what are the forms? The forms are this Platonic theory. We often call it a Platonic theory because it turns up in more than one of Plato's dialogues, often propounded by Socrates himself, tried to be defended by Socrates himself as the sort of spokesperson, we think, of Plato. But it's not clear whether Plato deeply believed in the theory of the forms or not. A lot of theorists treat it as if he did. A lot of theorists contest it. Anyway, in either case, we call this theory Plato's theory of forms. Plato thinks that there are these universals, we call them, these kind of property-like but substantive things, these objects that exist in a different level of reality. And we'll talk about this more when we get to the Republic, when we talk about the allegory of the cave and these things. But the idea is these forms exist in a different invisible realm, a different reality. The forms exist as abstract, eternal objects that we can only perceive with our mind's eye. We can't see them with our literal vision. And these are things like the equal. In this dialogue, it seems like Socrates is suggesting the equal. The very notion of equality is an object that exists abstractly in this invisible realm. And our soul is able to see these abstract objects when it is freed from material constraints, when it's not in this purely material realm of reality. So when it's dead, that is, when it's separated from its body, the soul can interact with, see all of these forms potentially, if it's lucky. As we'll see in the Republic, it turns out it kind of depends on whether or not we have the right kind of soul to be able to access this invisible realm. We'll talk a little bit more about the theory of forms when we get to this third argument for the immortality of the soul. Right, so the last argument we have left for the immortality of the soul in this part of the Phaedo is the Affinity Argument. So here's the Affinity Argument. The idea behind the Affinity Argument is, here's a reason to think that the soul is immortal. It's because the soul is like the forms. Let's think about the properties of the soul, the things that we associate with souls and the things that we associate with forms versus the things we associate with material, particular objects. And it'll turn out the soul is the most like the forms and not like material objects. Therefore, by analogy, if the soul is most like the forms in these particular qualities that we know about, then it must also have this other quality that the forms have, namely being eternal. Socrates is committed to the idea that the forms are eternal, unchanging, non-composite and uniform, but they're invisible. So the forms, because they're these eternal, purely conceptual things, are the sorts of things that only are invisible, but they must be eternal, right? So let's take a step back for a minute and think about an abstract object that we might like that doesn't yet sound so Platonic until you think about it a little bit. Think about our concept of number. Okay, so numbers, what are they really? There's a philosophical debate about this, but you might think, well, numbers are just ways of counting material objects. All right, fine. But, right, so here's one object, here's two objects. If you add this number of objects to this number of objects, you get 3. But is 3 just these objects assembled? No. One definition is it's the set of all of the objects that are assembled that have this, that have this many particulars or something like that. The idea is number is something that most people tend to think of as abstract, right? It's not something that we just know about from the countable objects in front of us. We can conceive of numbers that are things that we could never possibly count in our human lifetimes or count up to in our human lifetimes. If you want an example of one of the biggest numbers that someone has come up with and named, but that we certainly can't count, you should look up Ryo's number on Wikipedia. The idea is there are just these abstract notions of number that we can come up with that are so insanely big. We can never hope to count them, but we think that they're a real thing in some way, right? They're conceptually real. And now let's ask about numbers. Just because they're not visible, are they therefore unreal? Are they not real? Well, that would be a weird thing to say, right? Because mathematics has helped us explain so many physical rules, laws. We're very dependent upon mathematics to help us make sense of the world. So it seems like mathematics has some real pull in the universe. So math can explain lots of stuff. So it seems real, but of course, numbers are not visible. Mathematics is not something that is visual. I mean, of course, mathematicians might write out things that are visual, but numbers as an abstract concept aren't concrete things like this, right? This is a votive candle holder. That's a concrete object. I can't pull something out like this and call it the number 1. They're not totally explained by the numerals that we write them with. So think of the forms like that. Forms are like numbers. They're abstract, they're invisible, and they're also not dependent upon the material objects that we apply numbers to. So, right, so I can apply the number 1 to this object, and I can apply the number 2 to these objects. This 2 is a property of these objects, that there's 2 of them. That's the number of them that there are. But numbers are not kind of dependent upon those 2 votive candle holders. So then we ask about the soul. Socrates asks, is the soul more like these abstract objects like the forms, or is it more like these material objects like this? And his interlocutors say, well, it does seem like, we've admitted that the soul is different from the body, and the body decays, but it seems like we've accepted by now that the soul exists before we were born. So it's got kind of some length that it exists that is longer than the material length of existence of objects. So there's one thing. It's also invisible. So it's not like this. I can't kind of grab a soul and put it in my hand and show it to you. It's not concrete. It's in some ways an abstract. And so we conclude, look, if the soul is like the forms in all these ways, and it's more perfect than the body insofar as it's longer lasting than the body and it's invisible like the body is not, you can only grasp it with your soul. You can only grasp other people's soul with your own soul. Then maybe the soul is also eternal like the forms. So this is the conclusion of the argument. We get the conclusion that the soul will not dissolve or be destroyed, unlike the body. The soul is like the unchanging and the invisible. And we end up with this important conclusion to this part of the dialogue, that if it's true then that the soul is eternal, that it exists both eternally before we were born and eternally after we die, then the well-being of the soul should be our primary concern. If we truly love wisdom, then we should behave and seek what is real and what is divine, and not what is merely an object of belief. That is, we should pursue the things that are like these eternal forms. A philosopher's job is to learn about this immutable, invisible, conceptual world. And death is going to be the thing that's going to allow our souls, if we're philosophers, to finally attain that which they have been seeking, which is being able to be free of the material world that is kind of obscuring this invisible, really real reality that underlies everything. So we won't be limited to thinking that two is just these concrete things that are brittle, and if I drop them on the ground, they'll break. But two is actually abstract, it's eternal, it's a concept, and I only grasp it with my soul, or in this case with my mind. I only understand the number two up here. I don't understand the number two exactly with my sense perception. In the same way, I only understand the equal with my soul. I only understand the beautiful with my soul. And it's going to turn out, as we'll see, that I only understand the good with my soul. So I can't understand the good via my body. Pleasure is going to turn out to be a distraction. Pleasure is going to be something that pulls me into the material world, away from what is good for my soul. And what is good for my soul is wisdom. It's understanding the forms, including the form of the good, this abstract universal thing that we'll see later, that gives all of these particular objects their properties of goodness. And the beautiful, which gives all of these particular objects their properties of beauty. So Socrates leaves us with the thought that the philosopher, like him, right? He's trying to demonstrate being a good philosopher, is not going to be afraid of death, and is actually maybe even going to be excited to get the opportunity to see the world from the perspective of his pure soul, unencumbered by the material world. All right, so that concludes part 2 of this lecture. Please stay tuned for part 3, where we'll talk about some objections to Socrates' arguments for the immortality of the soul. See you next time.